When it comes to thinking about proportions on a character, I think it's important to keep in mind what it is that makes a figure masculine or feminine aside from the obvious. Okay, here we've got a man and a woman, and right now we're just going to talk about some of the subtle differences between what makes a figure feel more masculine and what makes them feel more feminine. Some of them are really subtle and some of them are not. Okay, the first one, and the most obvious, is shoulder to hip ratio. If you look at the widest point on this guy's hips compared to his shoulders are much broader than his hips. Whereas the female, her hips are basically the same width as her shoulders. And so one way to make a character feel more masculine or more feminine is to mess with that shoulder to hip ratio. To make a character feel really masculine, you could give them really broad shoulders and a really thin waist. To make a character feel really feminine, you could give them really narrow shoulders and a really broad waist. Something that contributes to that is that men tend to generate more muscle mass, women tend to generate more body fat. And that contributes to this feeling of a more angularity in men and more curviness in women. Because muscle is a harder substance than fat, right? And when it's flexed, it becomes rigid and gives a sort of angular feel. And so men tend to be more angles, women tend to be more curves. Men tend to be larger than women. And part of why that is that men's rib cages tend to be much larger than women's rib cages. Okay, and so you get a lot more mass up here than you do with women. Men's feet and hands also tend to be larger than women's. Their noses tend to be larger than women's. Their ears even. Most features that you make a little bit smaller is going to make your character feel a little bit more feminine, with the exception of lips and eyes. Okay, if you make a character's lips a little more full, a little bit bigger, they're going to feel more feminine. If you give a character makeup around the eyes or make the eyes bigger, that's going to make them feel more feminine. And part of the reason for that is that women tend to wear makeup more often than men do. And the places that they put that makeup is lips and around the eyes. Those are two of the most significant differences that women make with their appearance. And what that does, it makes the lips appear bigger and more full, and the makeup around the eyes makes the eyes feel bigger as well. And so giving your character a little bit bigger eyes or a little bit larger or softer lips is going to make them feel more feminine as well. The size and length of a character's neck also is going to make them feel much more masculine or feminine. A man's neck tends to be thicker than a woman's neck because there's more muscle mass there, right? There's these muscles here, the trapezoids here, that all these come up, right? These come out, and it makes the neck feel more squat. Whereas woman's neck, because it's thin, even if it's the same length and there's less muscle here and less muscle here, it's going to make the neck feel thinner and longer. Okay? Another thing that contributes to that is that the angle of the clavicle in men tends to be at a steeper angle than with women. And so something you can do to make a character feel more masculine or feminine is to mess with this whole area in here to make the neck feel longer. You can drop the shoulders down a little bit, drop the clavicle down just a little bit, and that will make that neck feel a little bit longer and more graceful, more feminine. Where you can also do the opposite thing here, right? Make the neck feel even shorter. Okay. Okay, there are other differences that there are other things that with men and women tend to be different, right? You look at the shape of the legs. They both have this basic shape, right? But because there's more muscle on the man's leg, there are more undulations or more differences in the form to make it feel more angular and more muscular. Whereas with the woman, you can take this line, and if you wanted to, you could bring this all the way down. There are much fewer changes in the form because there's not as much muscle there. Making a character feel masculine can be accomplished by giving them more chunks, making things chunkier and blockier, where you can make a character feel more feminine if you have more long continuous lines without any breaks. Where men, it's more this sort of a thing. Okay, now we're finally going to jump into designing a character. And with any character design, it starts with a character brief. So you get a description from your director or creator, or if it's your own story, you'll have your own ideas. That's what it starts with. In this case, I'm designing a character to be part of a larger Dungeons and Dragons party. Okay, so there's no specific story here other than there's going to be an adventure. And there are specific ideas I had for the character, but nothing in terms of an actual specific story. The character I did for this video is a gnome wizard. Before I started, I did some reading on gnomes and wizards as they exist in the world of Dungeons and Dragons because I'm still not super familiar with the world as a whole. I've only played 1.5 campaigns, so I'm still a rookie, but I really enjoyed playing. There were a couple of things I knew I wanted to do before I started. I knew I wanted my character to be female. I wanted her to feel friendly, and I wanted to give the impression that her magic was nature-based and that she did a lot of research about spells and magic. I started this particular character with various poses and general ideas in terms of her costuming, including props. I wanted her to feel full-figured despite the fact that she's very short, to emphasize the fact that she's a caring and nurturing person. The exaggerated femininity suggests a nurturing nature. A good way to make a character feel short is with the size of their head relative to their body. The fewer heads tall a character is, the shorter they'll seem. And vice versa, if you give a character a really small head and a big body, they're going to feel enormous. Whereas if you give them a really big head and a smaller body, they're going to feel really small. These sketches are all pretty rough, which is typical for my personal projects. Early sketches and thumbnails, I think, should be about exploring ideas, not about determining specifics. These sketches are only as clean as I need them to be for my own purposes. If I were designing this character for a client, I'd probably be providing them with slightly more polished versions of this character rather than the rough sketches I have here, just so that they could understand what I was thinking. Like I said before, character design is about the process, and people like seeing your process and your sketches and that sort of thing, but you also need to make sure that your clients know what you're doing. Things need to make sense. So however clean they need your sketches to be, that's how clean you need to do them. I have some clients that I have worked with a lot that we know each other well enough by now that I can send them rough stuff and they know what I'm thinking or what I'm doing. And so that's a nice place to be at, but it's not that way with everybody. Like I said earlier, character design isn't necessarily about the polished stuff, it's about the ideas. As long as your idea is communicating well, you can move on to the next one. I liked this sketch because it gave the right impression of the character. She has a sort of mismatched set of scrolls and a book, which suggests she's searched for knowledge in various places. It's not all the same kind of knowledge or the same kind of information, and the glasses reinforce that idea. She also has the gnarled staff that links her to nature and suggests that she's adventurous, so she has some grit. She's kind of got a balance between angularity and curviness and softness, which gives the impression that she's not only caring and kind, but she's also has a little bit of grit. The hooded cloak also links her to travel and adventure, which I like. After I decided on the general pose and props for the character, I started noodling out some of her finer details, including proportions and costume details. I wanted to give the impression that her staff was a piece of living wood for a couple of reasons. First, it reinforces the closeness I wanted her to feel to nature. Second, a living staff is something that would be obviously magical. She's got this staff that she carries around all the time that's producing berries and leaves and stuff. That's going to be obviously magical, which I thought was cool. I wanted each of the scrolls she's carrying to have their own distinctive style so that it's obvious that they came from different sources, like she's traveled around to gain her knowledge. Something I tend to do a lot is to take a sketch and draw over it several times to bring it to different stages of refinement. And working digitally has kind of spoiled me this way because I can adjust the color or opacity of a sketch and draw over it in a new layer, which is really nice. Working digitally is kind of a two-edged sword, I think. It's really nice because it speeds up the process, but then at the same time, people who jump into digital painting or working digitally without ever having really learned how to paint or work traditionally, I think they're missing out on a bunch of really valuable knowledge. I think it's important to learn how to mix colors on a palette, how to warm up or cool something down using paint. I love painting digitally. I love working digitally. It's really nice, but I do think a lot of people suffer because they've never really learned how to paint traditionally and they jump into paint digitally and they've handicapped themselves just a little bit. I wanted her costuming to feel well made and fit for rough use. I also wanted to have a subtle nature motif in there somewhere. The bottom of her dress is cut and embroidered to look a little like leaves or trees. Nothing super obvious or representational, but enough to give the impression of nature.